Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Christian Barrientos Ichaso, international lawyer. I work with international compliance and international trade, compliance, anti-corruption, and anti-crime. We start with Martin. He's especially a special operation intelligence journalist. He's author of a book of Twilight Warriors, and he was for Voice of America, Wall Street Journal, the Daily Telegraph, United Press International, France 24, and other media, como Forbes News and others. Hi, Martin, how are you?
Hi, Christian. How are you? Good to see you as always. We are continuing these podcasts with a view towards informing or perhaps synthesizing often confusing information that comes out of conflicts throughout the world, some of it which people never hear about, to try to get people better understanding of what is really going on, what happens behind the scenes, and where events that are often reported in a scattered way on regular news and other news broadcasts, where they are leading us. We try to project, we try to see ahead. And this is what we're going to try to do this week with Ukraine. I left out my usual update on Ukraine in last week's podcast, which focused instead on Iranian moves in Latin America, very, very little noted Iranian moves, I may add, to expanding its covert network on the US doorstep, bolster regional allies, and create a platform to respond to any US or Israeli attack on its nuclear program, which may have already reached the breakout point for producing a nuclear weapon, according to some of the latest intelligence. This was highlighted in Biden's trip to the Middle East last week, in which he said that the US would go to war with Iran if such a point was reached. This week, I will focus on the latest developments on the conflict in Ukraine, which confirm our assessment made some months ago that while Russia would continue to fare badly militarily, it would win the economic war against Western sanctions, at least initially. We don't really know at this point what is going to happen 2 years from now, which is when some reliable experts predict sanctions will seriously affect the Russian economy. We don't even know if Ukraine will exist by then. When Russia launched its invasion in February, the general conventional establishment view was totally the opposite of what is now happening. The conventional wisdom was that while Russia would beat the Ukrainian army, Russia would beat the Ukrainian army, but get crushed by Western sanctions. Its economy would be totally crushed, destroyed by the sanctions. The most sweeping and widely implemented, et cetera, et cetera. I remember, I forget all the hype. Now we're learning that even such high-standing establishment analysts like CNN's Fareed Zakaria are admitting that the sanctions haven't worked to substantially weaken Russia and are instead hurting the West a lot more, particularly the Europeans and much of the developing world, where fuel and food shortages threaten to wreak economic havoc. Unprecedented inflation caused by massive hikes in energy prices, fuel shortages, and shortages of wheat and basic grains, whose supply Russia now further controls by occupying a string of Ukrainian Black Sea ports, from which much of the world's grain supply moves, threatens economic havoc not just in Europe, but throughout the entire developing world. Add to this the green policies stifling production or use of fossil fuels in Western countries that have become which has become a kind of religious credo for much of the Western governing classes, and you have a perfect storm. I said from the very beginning of these podcasts, which have been highly focused on the conflict in Ukraine, that it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to sanction a nuclear power which is a major producer of vital commodities and can exercise effective control over key trade routes by virtue of its geography, without jumping up production of vast oil and gas reserves in the US and in Europe that have been shut down on the advice of Greta Thunberg. It must be the most ill-conceived and reckless sanctions policy ever implemented. And I really think that it is a case of Washington and its Western allies going into automatic, doing something that was done against lesser rogue regimes like Iraq, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, without thinking through what the effects would be in the particular case of Russia, and neglecting to make the necessary preparations to deal with the economic fallout. It would seem like studied calculations didn't even enter into the decision-making process. Russia has not only survived the sanctions, but the spike in oil and other commodity prices they've caused placed Moscow in a position to blackmail Europe and members of NATO, which are having to walk back and make exceptions to the sanctions and engage in back-channel negotiations with Putin to mitigate the most dangerous effects they could have on their own economies. It's quite incredible that while certain high-level US State Department officials strongly pressured Germany quite publicly to shut down its imports of Russian oil and gas that powers about 40% of its economy, it's now Russia that is threatening Germany to cut off gas supplies, and they've got Germany jumping. I am repeating here what I said some weeks ago, but when few others were saying it and believe that it's important to emphasize this point, which is indicative that we have people in key policy-making positions who really don't seem to know what they're doing. I have until now refrained from attacking the elites that have become standard whipping boys for the populist right, but evidence is that we seem to be sliding into a situation where the Western world is abusively governed by a new caste of policymakers who appear disconnected from reality and act as if, having gone to all the right universities, collected all the right degrees, sat in on all the right international meetings, and held a string of high-sounding bureaucratic jobs, licenses them to make stupid decisions and idiotic measures that are destroying the lives of the very people whose taxes pay their large salaries. It's almost like a throwback to the decadent aristocracy of 18th century France. And I sincerely hope that it doesn't end up in a revolution from which Russia and other totalitarian powers would only stand to benefit. Farmers' protests currently ripping through Europe over inflation, high cost of fuel and fertilizers and other issues brought on by the war and green policies are indicative of this possibility, and a resounding defeat of the French governing party in recent parliamentary elections, and a similarly resounding defeat expected for the Italian governing party in upcoming elections, indicates without any doubt that public opinion in Europe is turning radically against policies followed by the EU, or by EU countries, put it that way. I try not to be overly opinionated and remain as objective as possible in my reporting, but it's difficult to remain objective and serious without laying out the facts that are plain to see. One cannot do an honest job of analysis by dancing around a problem. The government of Germany and other European countries should immediately assume emergency powers to suspend green regulations and shift to oil, coal, and nuclear power as soon as possible. There are some signs that this is happening, but not with the necessary urgency and speed, in my humble opinion. Oil and gas is the most potent weapon Russia has in this war if the West refuses to produce its own. Wars are the ultimate stress tests. By stretching a nation's capacity and resources to maximum levels, wars tend to expose the weakness of governing systems. Russia's disastrous start to its war in Ukraine, when its offensive to take the capital Kyiv collapsed, exposed the glaring weaknesses of Putin's regime. But the war's continuation and Russia's ability to withstand Western sanctions are revealing the glaring weaknesses, deficiencies of Western governments. Changes are clearly needed, and the great advantage that the West ultimately has is its system of democracy, by which those responsible for bad and irresponsible policies can be ultimately held accountable and fired by the voters. So let's take a look at what's been happening on the ground in Ukraine over the past week or two. Following the cutoff of Russian gas supplies through the Nord Stream pipeline that supplies Germany with 40% of its energy, the German government of Chancellor Scholz had to tell Canada to waive Russian sanctions and release turbines that the German engineering company Siemens had been servicing at special facilities in Canada for the Russian oil company Gazprom prior to the war. Russia insisted that it needed to replace the turbines as part of repairs it's conducting on its pipeline network to get it back into full operation. Otherwise, the cutoff would be permanent, Russia threatened, or has threatened, continuing to threaten. Germans would freeze this winter, and Europe's biggest economy could come to a halt. Canada released the turbine, and repairs should supposedly be finished soon after it gets to Russia in about a week. But everyone is now sitting on the edge of their seats, waiting to see if Russia really resumes the flow of gas or starts making more demands on Europe. Reuters reported a letter Monday, supposedly sent by Gazprom, warning of a permanent suspension to Germany and other European states, citing force majeure or mitigating circumstances. This may just be Russia playing with the Europeans by scaring them into caving into further demands, which I expect will involve releasing high-tech electronics to Russia required by its military. China has been filling some of the shortfall. These high-tech stuff has been denied by the sanctions. China has been filling some of the shortfall, but it can't sufficiently replace Western components that Russian arms producers are used to working with. The cutoff of Russian gas to Germany made the euro drop to below parity with the dollar for the first time since 2002. Its resumption would make the euro surge. So Russia's control of energy, with multiplied value added by Western sanctions, actually puts Moscow in the position of manipulating one of the world's main currencies. Moscow already manipulated the value of its own currency by demanding payment for gas and oil in rubles, to which most of the world agreed, including the Europeans, despite a lot of screaming and kicking. This sent the ruble up against the dollar to pre-war levels. Similarly, with food, UN brokered negotiations with Russia on food supply, which I anticipated in this podcast some weeks back, were conducted in Turkey last week, with the aim of opening sea lanes from lanes can safely move to avert massive famine in Africa and the Middle East. Russian and Ukrainian negotiators faced off for the first time since the war began and appear to have struck a deal that still awaits the green light from Putin. As for the Russian ship Turkey stopped at the end of June carrying stolen Ukrainian grain, from which the Turks were supposedly going to seize, it's been let go and is believed to have been allowed to sail back to Russia with all its grain. The authoritarian of Turkey, a NATO member, Erdogan, is having a personal meeting with Putin in Iran this week to further discuss the grain and shipping issues. So everyone is suddenly being nice to Putin. After we were told at the start of the war that Russia was totally isolated by the US and its Western allies. Whether Europeans freeze this winter or whether Africans starve is now in the hands of Putin. Can we expect Putin to suddenly turn into a nice guy? He'll probably make some gestures and concessions to show his largesse and enhance his international standing. That's my guess. Any permanent solution to energy and food crisis he would offer, might offer, will certainly be linked to a politically negotiated settlement in Ukraine that at least recognizes Russian military and administrative control over eastern sections of the country that his army now occupies. We have also seen this week that Germany and the EU pressured Lithuania to lift its blockade of Russia's Baltic enclave of Kaliningrad, divided from Russia by Lithuanian territory. So it really looks like Putin is managing to get his way and forcing the EU to play ball with him. This is again something I predicted in previous podcasts, in which I said that Putin would ultimately establish his own back channel negotiations with the EU, sidelining NATO and the US. Now there are even signs that China's leader Xi Jinping is trying the same thing by inviting the main EU leaders from Germany, France, Italy, and Spain for a meeting in Beijing next November. Russia will have to rely primarily on economic and political pressure to reach a favorable settlement over Ukraine, because latest indications are that its army may again be underperforming. While Russia's offensive in eastern Ukraine over the past month succeeded in asserting control over the Luhansk province and most parts of Donetsk with the aid of local separatists, it's having trouble moving much beyond that and appears threatened on the southern front along the Black Sea. The recent deployment in Ukraine of close to 200 US and NATO supplied long-range artillery pieces, including 12 high-mobility HIMARS multiple-launch rocket systems are being felt on the battlefield. It's allowing Ukraine to counter the advantage Russia has enjoyed until now in artillery and blunt further moves into western parts of Donetsk and towards the industrial and gas-producing center of Kramatorsk, which is Russia's next main target. We've heard some blustering statements from Russian generals over recent days about resuming offensive operations following a pause. But Ukraine's newly supplied artillery is clearly hampering Russian efforts to stage new offensives. By enabling Ukraine to destroy main supply and ammunition depots and threaten communications, command control, and other strategic rearguard facilities on a constant basis, has prevented Russia from organizing and massing forces for major new attacks. ¿Dónde me perdiste, Christian?
¿Ah?
¿Me perdiste?
No, solo que apagué la cámara porque la conexión era lenta.
Okay.
Cortamos esto y continuamos. Okay.
¿Listo?
Okay.
The Russians further appear to be overextended and under serious pressure in their southwesternmost positions, closest to Odessa, which remains firmly under Ukrainian control. Ukraine has said that its ability to fire anti-ship missiles from there have even forced Russia to remove warships it had in blockading positions around the port, and that it is starting to resume some grain and that Ukraine is starting to resume some grain shipments from Odessa over recent days, rather. I think this is a very, very new development. The Ukrainians are now launching attacks into the outskirts of Kherson, Russia's main stronghold at the extremity of its southern front, where the Russian garrison is in serious danger of being cut off by stepped-up Ukrainian artillery strikes on ammo and supply depots, as well as guerrilla-type activity conducted by Ukrainian special forces units operating with local partisans along Russia's rear in the Kherson sector. The Russian high command is probably having a hard time deciding whether to reinforce the south to secure Kherson at the expense of detracting troop strength from a planned renewed offensive in Donbass. Morale problems also continue to plague the Russian army. Over the past month, Russia's internal security agency, the FSB, has mounted a major operation to seek and round up what's estimated could be thousands of deserting Russian soldiers trying to escape Ukraine and make it back to Russia or even other neighboring countries. So far, they report having caught about 100, but the number could be far higher, and many more may have managed to flee. According to British intelligence reports, Russia may have lost up to 30% of its fighting strength in the Ukraine with not only desertions, but casualties of both dead and wounded, approaching 50,000 men. A far larger number than was estimated by the Pentagon in their reports on this matter 2 weeks ago. But whether all this means that Ukraine can ultimately launch sufficiently strong counterattacks to push the Russians out of eastern areas they already control, and are working to incorporate into the Russian state through establishing Kremlin-linked administrative systems, passing out Russian passports to local residents, and so on, I doubt it. Even the most hawkish Ukrainian military and political officials say that they would need at least 10 times the amount of artillery and other supplies that NATO has delivered thus far to push the Russians out. And I don't think that the US or NATO are prepared to go that far. I could be mistaken, but I don't think so. Allow me to finish by mentioning a news item that's just come out about Ukraine's President Zelensky. He suspended his intelligence chief and top law enforcement official or attorney general, along with about 60 top and mid-level security officers, pending investigations over presumed cases of espionage or collaboration for Russia. I thought of starting my podcast with this piece of breaking news, but I don't read too much into it at this point. Zelensky has conducted similar protests in the past, which may have more to do with securing his personal power than any high treason by his officials. It is difficult to see how Ukraine, which has maintained historically close connections with Russia, wouldn't have a lot of officials who have worked with Russia in the past, a factor that may indeed have prompted the invasion in the first place by making Putin believe that he could easily install a pro-Russian government. It's been recently revealed that some Ukrainian state officials in eastern regions occupied by Russia have now turned and are cooperating with Moscow. This factor may indeed have forced Zelensky into a response, which he did by moving in on the departments to whom these turncoat officials seem to belong. It is obviously difficult to run a stable government in the middle of a war in which a fifth of your country is under enemy occupation, and whether Zelensky has made the latest move under the influence of hardliners or is just trying to assert his authority is hard to gauge at this stage. I'll keep you posted. Christian?
I don't have questions. It's very interesting report of this podcast. You continue with the other podcast. It's very interesting about the news in this moment in Ukraine. But I don't have questions.
Well, I think pretty much good. I mean, I guess I've covered everything I possibly can here. Again, I'm trying to synthesize events of the past week and put them in perspective and give some of my own opinions that, I really have refrained from doing in the past or don't wish to do too much. But I think the things have gotten to the point when it's very difficult, as I said earlier, to report on what is going on without pointing up the seeming incompetence, the almost delusional behavior on the part of a lot of Western leaders. I mean, it's something that is hard to judge. It is hard to understand under any kind of rational standard, or at least anyone that I know, anyone that I was trained in. So I've had to digress. I really don't like doing, because I really think it's the only way at this point of reporting the story in a comprehensive and realistic fashion. I invite our listeners to join us next week. I also invite you to support this podcast through contributions, through comments, through observations that you can post or send through a new Patreon online page, which we have established. It's on our letterhead. I think I'm giving a service here, which is necessary at a time in which there is so much international movement. There is so many international crises happening all at once that get to perspective, getting a cool-headed assessment, getting it into some sort of getting information into some sort of synthesized form is something which I think an educated or informed or a public that wants to be informed needs, especially at a time in which official and media coverage is often sketchy and leaves a lot to be desired. And governments are acting in an almost strange and sometimes suspicious way. And official statements are often come under a lot of scrutiny. As I say, we don't dwell in conspiracies, but we don't deny that they exist. Thank you for listening, and see you next week.
See you next week. Thank you all. Contribute for podcast, and see you next week. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Christian.